Hey everybody, super excited to be back. Another edition and really happy to be here today with Scott from Space and Time. So Scott and I met in Miami. It was in March this year.
Yep.
And I think sort of we just connected really well right at the go. And it was at a Chainlink event, right? It was a Chainlink breakfast. And we are both strong partners with Chainlink. So I thought it'd be great for you to share with the community what you're up to and some of the explorations that you're seeing in deep blockchain and deep big data activities. So yeah, welcome Scott, and maybe a bit of background on yourself rather than me doing it. I'll let you do it. And nice to meet you again.
Sure. Yeah, appreciate that. Super happy to be here, and definitely excited to be chatting with the team. Yeah, things have been going really well. So my background, I'm the CTO and co-founder of Space and Time, which is a enterprise scale decentralized data warehouse for Web3. Joining, large cluster compute, handling both on-chain and off-chain data, and allowing our customers to run queries which join all their on-chain data with all their off-chain data in a very scalable, very fault-tolerant, but truly decentralized way. Bringing enterprise scale queries to Web3.
And that's sort of, I think, what was really interesting and why we sort of connected really well is what we're doing at Truflation, right? We're aggregating a lot of data from real world price information, right? I'm trying to bring that on chain. How do we process that really fast on chain, right? At the moment, we're doing a lot of the processing off chain and then putting that on chain. How do we do more of that processing directly on chain? And how can we do that? And I think that's where Space and Time is actually really trying to innovate and make some of that possible. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that'll be an interesting area.
Yeah. I think, yeah. And so I think you've got, one of the challenges you had was really scaling up and finding, engineers, and finding the right talent. How do you find, given the sort of slight, so certain people I've been talking to have found that the market has changed, the crypto community's dropped, there's less faith, tourists have left, and sort of, how do you feel? And some of the projects have dropped, or it's been too hard. Let's go. Let's rug and then leave the engineers on their own and go to the beach or something. How do you find, has that changed for you? Have you seen a greater talent pool come onto the market and then make that, with experience in blockchain, with experience in big data, that all of a sudden you actually now can be scale up and leverage this opportunity to further develop Space and Time at a faster pace?
I'm hoping so. Yeah, I think the scaling challenges have been interesting in the last month or two.
Yeah.
So we've been really focused on all of our database engineers, not so much our smart contract and Web3 hiring. And I think now with I'm saying that we've been focused up until recently on those areas, and that's been a lot of hard work. Just good recruiters going on LinkedIn Recruiter and reaching out to talent and kind of sourcing this exact people from from my background in big data warehousing and my background in like enterprise analytics solutions and like finding people from the network. But now that there's a shift in kind of Web3, the few Web3 corporations that were recruiting heavily have just let a lot of people go, or are now, there's a lot of vacancies in the market. And that's a lot of great Web3 engineers that are now looking for a job. And I think you're positioned well. I'm positioned well. We're at a point where we can leverage some of that talent on the market.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, sort of actually maybe, we went right deep right away, but maybe stepping back a bit, and I think the way you explained to me what you're doing is really trying to bring at Space and Time, bring a sort of Snowflake type experience on chain. Would you say that's a correct analogy? And if so, what is Snowflake? Maybe for some of the audience that don't know Snowflake, maybe just sort of give a bit of background. What is so unique about them? Because they had a great IPO. And so maybe just explain what that is and how
I think it was the biggest.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it was the biggest
Yeah,
IPO of 2020. We are kind of describing space and time as a Web3 native Snowflake, or Snowflake for the
yeah,
blockchain world, Snowflake for the Web3 world. The challenge in doing so is that we don't want to lock ourselves too much into the data warehousing only space, because space and time is building a hybrid database and data warehouse. What
yeah,
Snowflake is a large scale cloud native data warehouse for the enterprise. They allow you to kind of scale your queries infinitely. Run one query and pay for it. Run 1,000 concurrent queries that could process terabytes of data and pay for that. And so it's a run your own, pay for what you use, effective kind of scaling solution for running as many queries as you need to against as much data as you need to. And we generally think
yeah,
about a data warehouse in the terabyte range, not the gigabyte range that we think of
yeah,
databases. And we think about Snowflake only for analytics, right? For analytic jobs, OLAP, online analytic processing. Whereas
yeah,
in Web3, I'm seeing a huge need for both OLAP, online analytic processing, and OLTP, online transaction processing. Very, very fast, low latency kind of those quick queries that say, show me Scott's recent transactions on Polygon in 0.01 second, versus like the big process terabytes of data and give me a result back on some analytic job in 30 seconds or a minute. So my point is, in Web3, there's a need for both. And I think
yeah.
Snowflake is beautifully handling one of those areas in Web2, and we're trying to handle both.
And so we've all heard of sort of projects like Arweave that are bringing data storage, right? So not necessarily real data warehousing and even the processing of that data. It's just retrieving and storing. And then you've got projects like maybe Filecoin that are trying to add an element of infrastructure on chain. How do you complement them? Do you work with them? Or how do you see that sort of map out against space and time?
Yeah, space and time you could think of as a cache over a
Yeah,
decentralized storage infrastructure like IPFS. Maybe someday Arweave or Filecoin. We're talking to folks in both of those ecosystems and kind of figuring out a strategy of how we approach both of those areas. As
yeah,
others include things like Storage or storage.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so decentralized infrastructure is really interesting to us. It's not really an area that we want to be competing in, because we believe there's going to be so many good players with so many good solutions for decentralized storage. We kind of want to build a composable cache that sits over them, where we can pull in the hottest data sets or the most frequently accessed data, relational, tabular data from IPFS based solutions like Filecoin or Arweave, and then have them cached in space and time for much faster access.
And so basically, space and time sort of becomes chain agnostic, if you will, right? I mean, you leverage all the infrastructures that are out there and the different chains and support each one of those.
Yeah, I think Chainlink has done a good, this is a big nod to Chainlink. They've done a really good job of
Yeah,
of being chain agnostic and building like
yeah,
kind of refusing to build their own chain in favor of being a bridge between all major chains and a bridge between off-chain and on-chain data. And I think we want to take a similar approach. And that's not just
yeah,
chain agnostic, that's also storage agnostic. Like, we want to be a bridge between, or not a bridge, we want to be a data warehouse that has capabilities to access, to read and write data to Ethereum, Polygon, Binance, Avalanche, you name it, Solana, but also be agnostic on the storage side, where today we
yeah,
might run our own IPFS based secondary storage, and tomorrow we might be using Arweave.
yeah. And would you then also integrate into Web 2 storage capabilities as well? So I can then switch between Web 2 and Web 3 and integrate between the two.
Absolutely. We're doing a
Yeah,
lot of work on our engineering, on our R&D right now, on the Web 2 side of things as well. I think that's the easiest area to tackle, because uh, data warehousing on top of Web 2 storage is mature. The
yeah,
ability to push down processing to S3 on Amazon, or Azure Blob Storage, or Google Cloud Storage, or other databases that are federated, like push down processing and read and write from Postgres or something. Like, I think that's an area that's the easiest to integrate because those tools already exist. What doesn't
Already
exist
exists.
is the integration with Web3 decentralized
Yeah,
storage. It's like this. Like
yeah,
the
yeah.
future is you as a customer should put your data wherever you need to. Like if you have data sets that exist off chain somewhere in API feeds or in other databases or other enterprise data warehouses in the cloud, great. You should be able to pull those into space and time. If you have data that already exists in some IPFS based decentralized storage, great. You should pull that into space and time and run queries against it.
Yeah,
Finally, if you have data on chain, that to me is the most important. We should grab all of that,
yeah,
index it, and make that available. And then ultimately join all three. Join your off chain
yeah.
Web 2 data, join your decentralized IPFS based stored data, and join all of your on chain transactions and on chain transfer of value in one analytic process and give you a query engine to allow you to do all three.
And I think that's the interesting element, right? I think there's so much data on chain, right? All these explorers that present data that are very hard to query and then correlate between, actual offline and stored data with some of the transactional data to then correlate value with actual data sets that I have in my network. So I think that's a super interesting area to sort of really build out on.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah, I
curious
mean,
how is Truflation
yeah,
thinking about it? How is
yeah. I mean,
Truflation thinking about that?
I am really keen on getting much more pricing information and transactional data, and identifying what is an inflation associated with on-chain transactional data, right? I mean, how do I capture that? At the moment, we're going to all these different sources, from Zillow for real estate data, Trulia. So we're pulling them all from existing API feeds and then aggregating them and then looking at the historical data associated with pricing information. But if I have a piece of property and there's been a transaction with that, I can see all of the history associated with that piece of property and how often it's changed hand and what's the inflation over time been with a specific individual piece of property, or aggregate that in a neighborhood. And then I can then look at that zip code, what transactions have been like for the similar square foot area, right? How do I do that on chain? How do I identify, this address has had 15 different transactions. What is in this address? What is associated? It's an NFT. Okay, I can then identify this NFT has changed hand 15 times. And then ultimately, off the back of that, I can see the price appreciation or depreciation associated with that transaction. How do I extract that? And we've been partnering with a couple of on-chain companies that have been taking the on-chain data and then taking that off-chain and leveraging a space and time to find that, right? And ultimately, as soon as they take it off-chain, it's I don't know what the right word is, but I mean, it's adulterated, right? I mean, it could be changed. It could be, again, is it verified? How do
Yeah,
I
we think
verify that
about
that's
it like
accurate and all of that, right?
yeah, yeah. I think we see that as an analytic black box, and
Yeah,
uh, there's nothing wrong with putting data off chain. Even space and time is off chain, right?
yeah,
I think where it gets interesting is providing transparency to the community around what you're doing off chain and what your analytics are, and building trusted, proven, cryptographically guaranteed analytics off chain. I'm really curious to know from your end, like uh, as you guys look at this inflation data and run some analytics off chain, what you're starting to see.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely, I mean, we're seeing more and more. We're now aggregating, some 10 million, we're capturing 10 million price points, items, price point for 10 million items. And we're aggregating that from 40 different aggregation service providers. And we're getting the real-time price information. So we're doing it in real time. And we're now breaking it down. We're seeing there's a demand for subcategories. So they don't just want any more of the CPI index itself. They're wanting some of the subcategories. We had 6, we're now extending it to 12. And so we're breaking it down all the time, further and further, and we're getting more granular as the market wants more granular information. The other thing we're seeing is people want it more geographically specific. So how can I get information of what's inflation in Austin versus San Francisco, right? And is there a difference?
Right.
And how does that impact? And then what does that correlate to nationwide inflation sort of type things, right? So there's more analytics that people want. And then ultimately, the demand is actually coming from TradFi, hedge funds, private equity firms, Wall Street, which I had totally not seen coming as much as I thought it was actually going to come from DeFi projects and smart contract projects and things like that.
So then one more quick follow-on question, just from
Yeah.
my understanding, what use cases around both DeFi and TradFi does that open up? Like I'm really curious to know how this new on-chain data around inflation is being used.
Multiple ways. I mean, yeah. I mean, we're seeing it on synthetic assets. So how do I put pricing to synthetic assets? How do they deviate? We have online salary companies updating salary, crypto salary based on inflation. We have analytics with people trying to bet on it, obviously. So prediction markets trying to sort of build prediction around what inflation is going to be. Which ultimately there's also going to be perpetuals that are going to be built off the back of this, right? Sort of long-term changes in terms of being able to have options open associated with treasury inflation protected securities that allow me to offset or make up on the rewards that I need to for real world, protecting my real money, if you will, on real terms. So
That's
it's
awesome.
been really interesting to see that. And just ultimately, different feeds, different customer segments. We've now got 3 different customer segments that we've identified. But for us, it's really I see a couple of challenges, right? So a lot of people are asking for us for on-chain data. They want the data on-chain. How often at the moment we're capturing it, aggregating it, and then putting it on-chain once a day? Because if we do it too often or in real time, whenever we get it and process it, it could become a bit more expensive. And so ultimately cost is a big driver in terms of why we're not putting it on-chain as quick as we could. And so I'd love to see how we get more infrastructure, better tooling that's going to help us bring it on chain and then ultimately drive a community to engage with us in terms of how we optimize the algorithms associated with that data source for milk, for real estate, for other commodities possibly.
I think the two areas that will be really paramount from an infrastructure perspective is application development and how applications, and I mean specifically dApps, Web3 dApps, can be built on top of that data and on top of the analytics around that data. And then the other area is connecting that directly to smart contracts and like how you can connect that data to smart contracts in a trustless kind of cryptographically guaranteed or tamper-proof way, knowing that if your smart contract, for example, if you build a derivatives market on inflation data or a predictions market on inflation data, and that market is all on chain, how do we know that the inflation data that's feeding that predictions market is accurate and guaranteed and tamper proof? And I think that's where the infrastructure will play a key piece. From a dApp development standpoint, I'm really excited to see how dApp developers bring these new markets or these new use cases with both trusted analytics, i.e. space and time, and new data sets, i.e. Truflation, bring those to the users and bring those to the masses. Like how can applications be built? So like step one is first getting all the data into a usable, organized format in a database that's decentralized and trustless, and where you can trust that the data came in from a place that we know, and also the analytics against it, the computation is trusted. Two, get that into a smart contract so that dApps can be built on that smart contract. And then 3, get that in the hands of the users. That'll be interesting to watch.
And so how do you view, I mean, there are a whole set of tool sets out there for developers that work and build dApps. Like they're working with Truffle Suite, with Moralis, and for building smart contracts and the dApps themselves. How do you view space and time integrating with those? Is that something that you're focused on as well? Or
Yeah, I think over time we want to provide more and more pre-built analytics services that are API driven and not so much SQL driven. Initially, space and time is a SQL query engine. You can store data like any other database, like you would in Postgres, like you would in Snowflake, and you can run queries on top of that. And ultimately, those queries are proven we have cryptographic guarantees against those queries, so you can actually provide the results to like a smart contract or a dApp. That's step one. Step two, though, is a whole set of REST API or GraphQL API driven services that actually power analytics inside of your dApp. So I'm not saying we're going down the Morales route of building a dApp development platform so much as we are building API driven analytics services for them to get access to these data sets. And then partners like Truflation could actually build their own set of APIs on top of Space and Time, where you can then provide a bunch of services to your customers, where all the customer does is gives us a parameter. Like, I want this type of data for this period of time. Like, I want real estate data in this market. Like I want real estate data in the Austin market over the last 3 years as parameters, and then we provide analytics back.
Okay. Yeah, because that was just exactly
which is a much different
No, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a much different use case than Morales. Whereas Morales is more, how do we get dApp developers up and running very quickly with like just like simple show me the wallet addresses involved in my app, those kind of things.
Yeah, no, and that's it. But coming back to your point, right? One of the big products we discussed today was exactly that, right? How do I do specific queries associated to the price of milk from these 15 sources in these different markets, and do a query like that, and between this time and that time period, and then what is the price and what has the volume been, right? So we were then trying to figure out, how do we display that? How do we, number one, provide a user experience where I can query that? And then number two, how do we display that so it is actually, people can understand what you're trying to display? And so that's been sort of more on the UX sort of side. And then at the moment, we're pulling it all from off-chain sources. So it's in an on-chain, it's in an off-site, a Web 2 database. We're aggregating it on there and we're querying that, right? And then so how is that verifiable to somebody that is independent and wants to make sure it's accurate? There's no black box associated with that. And so having that on-chain is there's definitely something that people want to know it's on-chain, and I can verify all of those price points just to make sure it's accurate and there's no scam associated with that data.
Absolutely. And then you think about the data stack kind of moving up from infrastructure, like providing the actual data warehousing infrastructure to store that data and do trustless computation, trustless queries against that data. That's kind of the base level infrastructure. And then the data products themselves, like the actual data and who's going to grab that data and who's going to build the analytics on top of it. And that's a very lucrative market, and not just lucrative, but very important. Like, it's going to be probably the most valuable market to the Web3 developer. And then on top of that, the apps themselves, like what apps can be built on that data, on that compute engine or that query engine that powers the queries against that data. So I'm always very fascinated to see as companies kind of grow and expand and scale, where they move, up the stack, from data product to application on that data product, or do you focus on bringing more and more data products and you leave it to the community, you leave it to the Truflation ecosystem to build dApps on top of your data?
Yeah, and that's sort of the route that we've gone, right? So how do we get the community to build on top of? And that's partially why we did the Chainlink Hackathon, right? We sponsored the Chainlink Hackathon, and we had 29 creative teams come together and build on top of Truflation, and really creative ideas that we really want to foster and allow them to build on that, right?
What were some of your favorites?
So, I mean, there was a prediction market, which was really interesting. That to me was really the one favorite that I had, and there were a whole bunch of other things. I just submitted, the team submitted the responses. But to me, the other one was squared inflation, right? So how do I build, options associated with inflation data that allows me to, hedge and bet? I mean, ultimately it becomes a lot down to betting, and what is inflation going to be, and how do I make up inflation if I'm not going to get it from interest rates at a bank or a yield farm? how do I protect myself against, how do I protect my purchasing power, basically? And those were the most interesting ones that I saw.
I have a
Yeah, no,
background
yeah,
I have a background in derivatives trading prior to spending about 8 years at Teradata building data warehouses for the Fortune 500. I was
yeah,
building data warehouses for hedge funds doing derivatives trading, and we built like, about a 60 terabyte 60 terabyte data warehouse for derivatives data against the stock market, like
wow, yeah,
calculating the implied volatility of every single strike, of every single expiration, of every single security in real time as the prices of those securities changed. We have this massive streaming data set coming in where we're calculating the implied volatility. And one of the parameters or one of the model inputs for calculating IV is inflation, like the risk-free rate.
inflation,
And
yeah,
it's really interesting, like, to see you really can't even begin to calculate the volatility of a security. And soon that will be, we can think about crypto as the replacement for that. We'll say asset, calculating the
yeah,
volatility and the implied
of
volatility of
assets,
an asset in any kind of derivatives market will always require inflation rates. So it's not just the I guess the cornerstone of like understanding what's happening macroeconomically in the world, but it's also going to be a useful parameter for us to do any kind of options, derivatives, secondary markets, betting, whatever it may be. Inflation's vital for doing that. And the point of me bringing this up is there's this infrastructure stack where we are getting streaming or real time or data feeds from the real world, from outside sources. We
yeah,
are doing some kind of calculation or some type of, we'll call it ETL, extract, transform, load, or extract, compute, and load, or extract, calculate, load. And what we load that into, in your case, could be a smart contract directly. It could be an off-chain but trustless, decentralized database like space and time. Or in the short term, it could just be any database just to get you started to run calculations and do kind of some analytics before that data is provided back on chain. And I think that entire end-to-end stack of grabbing data from the real world, running some calculations or some compute on it, storing it in a target, whether that's on chain or an off chain but trustless, decentralized data warehouse, and then providing that ultimately to smart contracts. That end-to-end process will get more and more mature as both the
yeah,
infrastructure for capturing data gets more mature and
yeah.
products like yours get better data.
Okay. I think what we found, one of the challenges that we've had is, inflation data. I mean, the price of your milk or your phone or your phone bill or whatever doesn't change that much. It's not highly volatile, right? I mean, it changes over a monthly basis. So how can we get more granular so that we can see more volatility in a change of pricing information, right? And what categories have the highest volatility and express the biggest interest out there, and that's sort of where we've been looking at, and that would then be really interesting to a lot of I suppose the options and derivative products that are out there, because they love volatility, right? I mean, the more volatile it is, the more data I need in order to aggregate it. But on the same side, there's a whole category of customers that are spending a lot of money to try and evaluate how specific businesses are performing and how
Yep.
does inflation influence that specific business, right? So if the gas price goes up, what does that mean for your Netflix subscription? You still love to travel. You still have to go and drive back and forth to work. Netflix content may be coming down. Do I pull my subscription from Netflix and that gives me an extra couple of miles a month, tens of miles a month in driving back and forth? I don't know, but those are sort of the analytics that people want to start doing. And how do we find those correlations? And that's sort of what I think is where I'm looking to have the fun bit. Sort of, you saw that when kids stopped smoke, when smoking started to become untrendy or non-trendy, nobody starts, chocolate consumption would go up, right? So people would have candy more because they weren't smoking anymore, right? And so they had surplus income or amount money, and then they would spend that on alternatives, and that happened to be chocolate, or maybe now it's coffee because chocolate's also bad, too much sugar, or I don't know, so all of those correlations, and how does inflation influence each one of those? it's going to be interesting as we go into an inflationary market. I mean, we're already in there. So Truflation says us it's 12%, 11.8%. So yeah, and that's sort of
Are you seeing changes month to month? Does the March versus April versus May versus June versus July numbers, or is that going from 12 to 12.2, or is that bigger changes?
no, we're seeing changes month to month, and we're seeing changes, in fact, week to week. Yeah, so we're seeing, and in fact, you can actually see it day to day. But I mean, the changes are then zero point 0.1 or half a percentage point or something. So it's marginal, right? But in the end, you still see regular changes in prices because in aggregate across so many different items from so many different fields across the country, it's quite a broad range.
Absolutely. I mean, I can also
Yeah.
see how this really affects stable coins as well. So we're doing a lot of analytics around different stable coins and kind of the correlation between pegged assets and non,
Yep.
regular fungible tokens. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how, if we can treat the market like a foreign exchange market, in that
Yep.
in that assets are traded on chain, tokens are traded on chain as
Yep.
asset pairs in liquidity pools. And if
Yep.
we treat that like the foreign exchange market and do similar analytics, we're ultimately looking at risk-free rates, and we're looking at inflation across our own pegged assets as well. Like, I think the as the macroeconomic off-chain market changes, we can start to see every little effect wave through the tokenomics that we're
Economy.
also eyeing on chain.
And so that's one thing that we've been looking at and we've been talking to. So in my view is, in a way, Bitcoin has tackled inflation, right? I mean, they've got a finite number of supply. It goes up in price based on demand, right? So you know that. Stable coins provided, addressed volatility, right? So it would provide a certain level of stability. However, it was still pegged to the US dollar. And so one belief that we've really adopted is this sort of flat coin concept, right? Where here's a basket of items, and we are going to peg towards this basket of items. And there are companies like Frax doing in that direction, Sperax, Volt, and then Nuon, right? So we've got a number of different providers that are tacking it to BLS, but that's still according to the US dollar and the US pricing information. So we've tried to sort of, hey, use Truflation as the source of that basket, right? And it can vary, and you can get much more detailed. You can choose the basket, and you can just have that output, and you peg it to that. And that's going to be really interesting because then you'll see a bifurcation between, the national currency and what the actual basket of goods is. And if you think about it, money was invented to actually facilitate trade. It was to allow for an exchange of goods and services and simplify that. And we've gone away from that. In my view, it's become complicated to deal with money today. With a bank, I much prefer to send you a USDT way faster at any given time over having to log into my bank account, justify why I'm paying you. It's over $1,000 or $10,000. I need to give a whole KYC as to who's receiving it for a good and service that I feel you deserve. I want. You deserve money for that. I want those goods or those services. And why should we be able to exchange super easily?
Yep.
Anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely going to be more and more around how do we track inflation on chain and in the tokenomics that we have out there. And that's where I think
are you getting a lot of data from a wide variety of different sources, and are you having trouble, or I shouldn't say having trouble, are you spending a lot of engineering effort to ETL, extract, transform, and load this data into whatever kind of data sources that I should say targets that you're targeting, like whether it's a smart contract directly, like putting that data directly on chain, or putting that data in some off-chain database as a landing zone, as a staging zone before it goes back on chain? getting all these different disparate data sets. I mean, you keep talking about milk as a fun example, right? Milk versus gas versus home equity, you know, the kind of the Zillow real estate versus Fed numbers versus jobs, like unemployment. Like, you're grabbing all this different data. You know, how are you kind of munging all that into a data warehouse?
That is the challenge. So we are spending a lot of, I think you call it ETL. We're definitely spending a lot of time on that because we get in different formats, we get in different time intervals, and then we need to align them and make sure that they're correlated with each other and they make sense. And yeah, so we've got, I mean, 4 dedicated engineers that spend just their whole time figuring that out. Not anything to do with the architecture itself. It's just, how do I process all of this data? How do I categorize them? And it gets even granular, right? I mean, we have the ability at the moment to extract price, not just for milk. It's semi-skimmed milk, right? It's almond milk, it's oat milk, right? So it's like, all of a sudden in that category, you have a whole bunch of subcategories. But we have the advantage that there's been a lot of learning done in that area as well. And a lot of that has been added into barcodes, a lot of product information's into barcodes, and the retail outlets have categorized a lot of these already. So how do we extract from those sources and map those into our categories so that then we can make sure that the price of milk doesn't go into the price of real estate, right?
Yeah. And then I think the next step then is, then how do you, you know, proven data sets? Like, how do you think about proving that the data you're grabbing from your source has been grabbed in an accurate way, or a consensus driven way, or a trusted way, where we know that we're grabbing reliable data from reliable sources, maybe even redundantly from multiple sources, that kind of the Chainlink approach to grabbing off-chain data feeds.
Yeah.
Getting that into one kind of secured or tamper-proof data warehouse, and then building trustless analytics on top of that, or proof-driven, cryptographically guaranteed, tamper-proof analytics, so that when we actually provide the analytics to a smart contract to build secondary markets on chain, to build prediction markets on chain, to build any kind of dApp that allows people to make any kind of transfer of value against that data, how do we do so in a trustless or decentralized way? I think is an area that you and I both are really interested in, and kind of iterating through, and like figure out what the next steps are for that kind of data product.
Yeah, and how do we build on that? How do we, exchange learnings associated with having identified solutions or problems, to then maybe you've addressed one, I've addressed something else, and then we can then relay those and move as a community forward to bring better products to market that are going to be 10x better than what I'm experiencing in the world today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think as a developer, you have to build on that trustless data.
Yeah. No, I think there's so much more here, and I think I know we're coming to the end of our time, so I'm just really conscious that I think we're on a journey in terms of what we're doing and what we're trying to identify and how we're doing it. We're in the middle of a big transformation. As everything shifts more on chain, gets more on chain, gets more trustless, and we have the appropriate tooling to make that possible. You go back 7 years ago or 5 years ago, there were no tools. I mean, the tools were just emerging, right? There was nothing there. And this is such a nascent industry. And there is so much data on chain that hasn't yet been extracted properly, right? And how and what, and it's really abstract. You really need to have a very three-dimensional mind in order to figure out how to abstract something like that and then analyze it and provide an interpretation of what that means from an economic standpoint to the different individuals, right? Number one in the financial market, number one in the realtor market, and number one in building products and solutions market, right? So I think what Space and Time is doing is really cool. And look, I really look forward to coming back in a couple of months or a year's time and seeing how much further have we come, right? And where are we today? and how is space and time and Truflation really working together in a solution on chain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting, and,
Um,
and I'll finish by saying
yeah.
it's very much a build it and they will come kind of approach, and I think Chainlink paved the
Yeah.
way. Chainlink probably
Yeah.
in the early days of people using oracles, it was very much a build it and they will like he, folks like Sergey at Chainlink were thinking a little ahead and thinking, okay, at some point this infrastructure is going to be needed to enable all these new use cases that people haven't even thought of yet, and both space and time and Truflation are in the same area. Like inflation data will become so vital, and infrastructure to manage massive volumes of data coming in from both the blockchain and the real world, and joining that together will become vital. So we build this infrastructure and we wait for all the exciting new use cases to be built on top of it. And
Yeah.
I'm excited to see what our partnership together will mean.
Yeah. And what can we do, or what can we help promote and to get creative people to build on top of space and time and work with space and time? I mean, where can they follow you? What, do they go, what's the website? What's the best channel to sort of interact and
Yeah,
follow the
absolutely.
performance of space and time?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Space
Yeah.
and Time DB at Space and Time DB on Twitter.
Yeah.
Spaceandtime.io is our website. It's a beautiful, fun, kind of interactive website if you want to go check it out and see something a little off the beaten path, a little more creative. So definitely take a look at spaceandtime.io.